Hey there, and welcome to Les Aristocrats Makers. Today we'll be making a decorative wooden sign that you can display in your home. In this video, I took my inspiration from one of my favorite films as a child, Pocahontas. I found that film had so many inspirational quotes, and I just wanted to display it in my home. So we'll start off with some balsa wood. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut leaf shapes as well as some feather shapes, just so that it can give our artwork a little bit of a 3D effect. Before cutting the wood, make sure you sketch out your desired shapes. You want to make sure you have a nice guide to follow. That way we're not scrapping any wood. No need for wasted materials. Once you have all your shapes cut, go ahead and place them to the side, but don't put them too far because we will be using them momentarily. So now what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out placement. I've printed off my quote. That way when I go to cut out my stencil with my Cricut, I know where all the letters are going to fall. So we're just figuring out placement right now. We're also going to do that with our leaves and feathers. Make sure you take the time to figure out your placement. You don't want to end up with a stencil that's too large and won't fit the surface that you have. You also want to make sure that all of your pieces that you've taken the time to cut out will fit nicely on the board. You don't want it looking too crowded and too messy. You want it to look nice and clean. Now that we're satisfied with the placement of all our letters and everything, we can go ahead and cut out our stencil. I used my Cricut machine to cut out my stencil. You can do it by hand or with whatever kind of cutting machine you might have. So what I used was a thin stencil film that I had. I will link that in the description box below. Once we have the stencil cut, we can place it on our board. You want to make sure you secure this into place. That way it doesn't move around on you. I used a little bit of Scotch tape. You can use whatever kind of tape you have. Now we want to make sure that we remove all our wooden pieces that we've cut out. We don't want to get any paint on them when we're painting our letters in. Once our stencil is all secured with our tape, we can go ahead and proceed with some primer. I'm going to use a white primer over my letters, That way when I go in with the colors, it pops a little bit more. So here I'm using a basic paintbrush. You want to use a stencil brush that you dab with, because if you use a paintbrush, what happens is the paint can creep underneath your stencil and you get little spills of it. The only reason I use this paintbrush is because I had forgot to put in my, I guess, negative space of the O, the A, and the P, and the R as well. That's the only reason I used a paintbrush, is so that I can paint those in. I'm going to use tape afterwards to cover up those negative spaces in those letters. Then I'm going to use a regular stencil dabbing brush. Try to learn from my mistakes. Put in those little pieces for your negative space letters. It's going to save you a lot of time. So for the primer, I did 2 coats for one reason. The only reason I did it was because I had 2 different textures, because I used 2 different brushes, and I wanted the same texture throughout the letters. So I just went over everything after I covered those negative spaces in the letters. I went over everything with the dabbing brush afterwards. That way, I have the same texture. I didn't want, paint strokes in some letters and then the dabbingness in other letters. I wanted it all to match. Now I'm going to add a little bit of color into my letters. So I wanted it to kind of look like a sunset. I took some orange and some yellow and then I blended it off into the middle with one of my spatulas. And now I'm going to take just an old makeup sponge and then I kind of dab it over top all the letters, making sure not to go over the top of the stencil because you don't want any orange marks at the top. You can do this technique with any colors that you would like your letters to be. I chose 2 colors that kind of blend well together. You don't want anything that's too heavily contrasting. Otherwise, the blending line won't look right. Just make sure that you cover all your letters. I only had to cover them once because I did 2 coats of primer. Once your letters are nice and covered and they're all even, you can go ahead and remove your stencil. Do not take the negative space out of the letters until they're dry. You don't want to end up leaning on the paint and smudging your work. As soon as the paint is dry, go ahead and take off those little stickers that we put in the negative space of the letters. I used an X-Acto knife just to kind of lift up the edges and then I peeled them right off. Now what I want to do is I want to give my lettering a bit of a 3D effect. I'm going to give it a bit of a shadow look with a paint pen. You can use a paintbrush and paint, that's perfectly fine. I just find with detail work like this, it's a lot easier to use a paint pen. So I'm going to go off of the right hand side of all my letters as well as the bottom. I don't want to go to the left side because that will take away the 3D look. That ends up just tracing the letters. I want it to look like the letters are like lifting off of the board. It's gonna give a cleaner look to the letters. It makes them a little bit more crisp. Now, keeping with the Pocahontas theme, let's add the colors of the wind. We're going to add a little bit of a flowing movement. That way when we place the leaves back on, it looks like they're blowing in the wind. I'm going to use some purples, a teal, as well as a blue. I'm really watering it down because I don't want it to be too harsh. We have to remember that we're painting wind. So we want to keep it soft and keep it flowing. Once you're satisfied with your wind flow, go ahead and place it aside and let it dry. Now we're going to proceed with our leaves and our feathers. We're going to paint them. All I did was I painted them a solid color each. So I think I used 4 different colors. I used a magenta, a plum, a vermilion, and a teal color. The paint I'm using is more transparent than opaque. I'm not doing more than 1 coat of paint with this because I want to be able to see that wood grain through the paint. Make sure not to forget the edges on the leaves as well as all those little nooks and crannies in between all the folds. You want your paint to be nice and even. Once you're done painting all your leaves, go ahead and place them aside, let them dry. As soon as they're dry, you can go ahead and grab yourself some paint pens. We're going to add a little bit of detail to them. We're not doing much. All I'm doing is adding a border to each leaf. That way they have more of a finished look. So go ahead and select your colors. You can either use the same colors that you use to paint them, like orange on orange or red on red, or you could do purple on green or green on purple, whatever you desire. What I did was on my vermilion, I traced them with the orange. On my magenta, I traced them with the red. That way they kind of blended. But then on my teal and my purple, I traced the purple with the blue and I traced the teal with the purple. I wanted to give it a little bit more of a funky look. Once we're all done tracing our leaves and our feathers, we can go ahead and place those aside. We won't be using them until the end when we're gluing them. Now let's add a little bit of highlight to that wind flow that we made before. All we're going to do is add a few brush strokes here and there of white paint. It's going to add enough detail to give it more of a flowy movement. This next step is completely optional. I used some Mod Podge and added a little bit of glitter. If you are doing the glitter step, make sure that you seal it. After the first Mod Podge layer has dried with the glitter, go over top of it with another layer of Mod Podge, locking it into place. Once everything's dry, we can now add our wooden shapes. So what we're going to do is we are going to place them on the board, finding where they are going to live. We're going to secure them with some wood glue. I used Gorilla Glue. It's the wood glue I had. You can use whatever wood glue you have. Once you're satisfied with the placement, go ahead and glue those on. Make sure that they're secured and you've used enough glue, but don't use too much glue because you don't want it to spill out over the edges. Now we want to make sure that we apply some pressure, ensuring that those pieces stay nice and flat. We don't want them curving up on us. What I did was I used a piece of cardboard and then I stacked some stuff that had a little bit of weight to it. I used books and plant pots. You can use whatever you have at home. I do not recommend you use clamps, as the balsa wood is softwood. You're going to end up with little dents in all of your pieces, and you don't want that. Once the glue is dry and all your pieces are secured, you're done. I hope you guys enjoyed this craft, and I hope you guys come back for the next one. If you have any suggestions for the next craft, please leave a comment down below. Remember to like and subscribe. Look for us on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us under Les Aristocrafts. Thanks for watching!